When I was a child, I thought there were happy Jews and sad Jews. But when I grew up, I realized that the happy Jews are actually Italians. Felt like that was a little risky, but I'm glad you laughed. One could ask the question, what is there actually to be happy about? The suffering in this world is immense. We have our own personal suffering. None of us escape death, illness, the suffering of our loved ones. We look at the suffering of our community, the nation, and the world. Over this past year, I met with 130 households from the congregation. And while I heard many stories of personal suffering, and I also heard many stories of rejoicing and wonderful things that have happened to our families, I would say 95% of the conversations ended up speaking about how worried people are about the future of our country. We also think of the suffering of our own people. Dan and I have been watching the new Ken Burns documentary on the United States and the Holocaust. Not exactly the cheeriest thing to watch leading into the high holiday period. This summer, we had the opportunity to travel to Italy. I went to Italy to officiate at the wedding of a dear friend, and we made a trip out of it after that. And we ended our trip in Rome, and we spent an entire afternoon in the Jewish Museum in Rome, partly because they had great air conditioning and it was hot. But we spent hours really thinking about the more than 1,600 years of anti-Semitism. And I read just one little story on the wall that really struck me, that there was a time when Jews in Rome, about 1,000 years ago, were forced to run foot races, and they were made to run them naked, and then they had mud thrown at them. And that lasted for about 200 years until the Pope stopped it. This was one teeny little story amongst millions. And we're on a 24/7 news cycle. And so we see every day the intractable domestic and world issues. And then this summer, if we had any complacency that we were safe, we experienced the horrible mass shooting at the July 4th parade in Highland Park. Some of us were there. Most of us probably knew people that were there, and many of us knew people that were killed and injured. And even if we didn't know them personally, they felt like somebody we would know because they were one of ours. And I will say, no one asked me, why here? Because we all know that that is no longer a relevant question regarding gun violence in America. And it feels unbearable. And yet, at the same time, for quite a bit of the summer, we read the weekly Parsha from the book of Devarim, from the book of Deuteronomy. And there's one word that repeats itself probably 24 times through that book, and that is the phrase, V'samachta b'chagecha, the commandment that you shall be joyous when your holiday comes. V'samachta b'chagecha is repeated 7 times in one parsha alone. Now, the parsha is specifically talking about rejoicing at the holiday of Sukkot, which is referred to as Zaman Simchatenu. But if I had saved this sermon for Sukkot, it would be a very small crowd that would be listening. V'samachta b'chagecha. Not a suggestion. The grammatical form is a command. So not a suggestion, not something that might be nice if you could bother to accomplish it, but the idea in the Torah that you must find a way to be joyful. Nachman of Bratslav, who was the founder of the Braslav Hasidic movement, who was born in 1772 and died in 1810, said, "It is a great mitzvah to be happy always. You should isolate yourself with a broken heart before God for a given time, but the rest of the day you should be joyful. It is a great mitzvah to be always happy and to make every effort to determinedly keep depression and gloom at bay." Nachman of Bratslav actually suffered from depression himself, so he was not naive about what he was suggesting, even though none of this came naturally to him. There is a Yizkor prayer in our Siddur that I absolutely love. It's a contemporary prayer, and it asks for the ability to remember, to cry, and to express my sense of loss. It continues, "May I always believe in the beauty of life, the power of goodness, and the right to joy." We read this every time we have Yizkor at the synagogue, and every time I'm struck by the prayer that in the face of mourning, because the Yizkor prayers, of course, are memorial prayers for those we've loved that we've lost, that at the time when we are reading these prayers that are such a sad reminder of the loss that we've suffered, that we ask God to remember that there's beauty in life, that there's goodness in life, and that we as human beings have a right to be joyous. What connects both this contemporary prayer and the teaching of Rab Nachman of Bratslav is the idea that we know that suffering is real and that it must be acknowledged. But at the same time, we have a right to recover and to recapture the ability to feel joy. And after all, wouldn't the people that we loved and lost really want that for us? And Judaism says it is our God-given right. Now, it may be our right, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to work at it. And so how do we work at creating a more joyous life? I read an interesting source. It was actually a woman that was mentioned in a novel that I was reading. Her name is Ingrid, I think it's pronounced Fattal Lee, and she's actually a Brooklyn-based designer and writer whose work focuses on the way that design affects our health and happiness. So she actually works with interior design and talks about the ability of how we create a space that is going to make us more joyous. Now, this isn't the woman that suggests we throw out anything that doesn't give us joy. That's a different person. Or as my friend said, I don't think throwing out my can opener is going to make me that happy. But in any case, this is a different designer who talks about how we create. So I know a few of you know what I'm talking about, and many of you are like, we don't know what you're talking about. But in any case. And so Ingrid Fattal Lee is the founder of an organization called Aesthetics of Joy. And she empowers people to find more joy in daily life through design. And this is what she says in her book, Joyful. She explores how the seemingly mundane spaces and objects we interact with every day have surprising and powerful effects on our mood. Drawing on insights from neuroscience and psychology, she explains why one setting makes us feel anxious or competitive, while another focuses acceptance and delight. And most importantly, she reveals how we can harness the power of our surroundings to live fuller, healthier, and truly joyful lives. And she writes, "Have you ever wondered why we stop to watch the orange glow that arrives before sunset, or why we flock to see cherry blossoms in spring? Is there a reason that people, regardless of gender, age, culture, and ethnicity, are mesmerized by baby animals and can't help but smile when they see a burst of confetti or a cluster of colorful balloons. We are often made to feel, she writes, that the physical world has little or no impact on our inner joy. Increasingly, experts urge us to find a balance and calm by looking inward through mindfulness or meditation and muting the outside world. But what if the natural vibrancy of our surroundings is actually our most renewable and easily accessible source of joy? Now, I know that many people benefit from meditation and contemplation, and I admire people that are able to do that, but I can say it's a struggle for me. I really struggle with the ability to sit still and be quiet. Anybody that knows me probably does not find that statement so surprising. So I was very interested in thinking about an alternative spiritual path. Looking inward, meditating, prayer, liturgy, of course, is part of our tradition. It is a spiritual path that's one way to access deep spirituality. But what if there's another path that asks us, instead of looking inward, to look outward? At the beginning of COVID, before I actually read this book, I actually feel like I practiced that. It was still so gray and cold outside, and Dan and I would walk every day. And I love being outside. I'm not a huge fan of cold and gray days, but every time I would go outside, I would look at the buds to see if there were any buds beginning on the trees, or we would see the swans who had returned to their nests and were laying eggs. And every day, in the midst of all of the horror that we were reading about in the newspaper, I would look for signs of spring and rebirth. My daughter-in-law said I sounded like a 19th century diary. Dear diary, today the swans returned to their nests. But it was one of the ways that I attempted to beat back what I would call quarantine-induced depression. Our Torah reading this morning has two stories. One story is the story of our matriarch Sarah giving birth. We're told in a prior parsha that angels come and announce that Sarah is going to have a baby, even though the Torah tells us that she has passed the age of being able to get pregnant. And she laughs, and she actually laughs and says, "Who would think that Sarah would have a baby with my husband being so old?" The angel asks her, why does she laugh? She's embarrassed. And the angel actually, when the angel retells the story to Abraham, says, Sarah laughs, saying, who would say that Sarah would have a baby when she was so old? So our tradition teaches us the angel didn't want to cause marital strife, so he fudged over what Sarah actually said. But in this morning's Torah portion, we read of the birth of Yitzchak. And Sarah says, when Yitzchak is born, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. The name Yitzchak, of our patriarch Yitzchak, comes from the word laughter. The joy and the laughter of celebrating something that was so longed for, that was given up on, that eventually came. And she says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. And so it's easy to laugh when joyous things happen. But our Torah portion this morning also has another story, a painful story of another mother, and that is Hagar. Abraham takes Hagar as a concubine when Sarah can't give birth to a child, and Hagar has a son, Ishmael. And once Sarah has her own son, Yitzchak, she does not like the influence that Ishmael has in the family and on her son, and so she tells Abraham that he needs to send Hagar and Ishmael away. And so Hagar is given a small amount of food and water. Why? Who knows? Abraham was wealthy. He could have sent her with more. And she goes out into the desert, and as the water runs out, she sits down a little bit away from her child because she does not want to see him perish, and she begins to cry. And then a voice comes down and says to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And then the Torah says, God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and let the boy drink. One of the great medieval commentators on the Torah, a rabbi who went by the acronym Malbim, said, "The well was always there. She just had not paid attention to see it, but now she saw it. She is so afraid, so lonely, so grief-stricken that she cannot see the well in front of her, and she has to make an effort to look up and see what help there actually is." It's easy, like Sarah, to laugh in times of joy. It is much more difficult to be panicked like Hagar, to be grieving like Hagar, and to see the help that's in front of us. Now, some of you may think, big surprise, the rabbi is speaking about finding joy in the same year that she and Dan became grandparents, because we do have pretty easy access to joy right now. But one of the great joys of being with young children is seeing the world through the fresh eyes of our grandchildren or our children. Our son posted a video of Tavor, our grandson, sitting on the floor, and he was blowing bubbles. And Tavor was looking sort of mesmerized by these bubbles. How many of us may be some scenario where people are blowing bubbles or throwing confetti or doing whatever thing that Ingrid Fatali says make us joyful and barely even notice? But when you see somebody who's seeing them for the very first time, it helps you to pause and see it through fresh eyes. Lifting up our eyes is very difficult, but we are commanded to try. And to quote Fatali again, what if the natural vibrancy of our surroundings is actually our most renewable and easily accessible source of joy? And it doesn't just happen in nature. It could be in our homes. It could be with what we wear. It could be with what we look at on the internet. If pictures of baby animals make you smile, maybe you should spend more time looking at pictures of baby animals. And of course, there's music. For me, probably one of the easiest and most instant ways to experience a change in mood. And I hope if you get nothing else from this service today, you can close your eyes and immerse yourself in the beautiful, beautiful music of our service. 20th century Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel added a new phrase to the Jewish spiritual lexicon, something he described as radical amazement. And this is what he says: "Our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed." What I love about our tradition is that it is not Pollyannish about suffering. It is not something we live through to get our reward in heaven. Suffering is not an illusion. It's not given to us because God only gives us what we can bear. I hate that phrase. I think it is actually immoral. So if you say it, stop saying it. To tell somebody that's suffering you only are given what you can bear is cruel, and it frankly should encourage people to want to be very, very weak. Following mitzvot in Judaism is often hard work. It takes stamina, effort, and commitment. And the command, v'samachta, to be joyful, is really no different. And so in our Siddur we ask, shelter me with the gift of tears. Let me express my sense of loss, my sorrow, my pain, as well as my love in words unspoken. Bless me with the gift of prayer. Strengthen me with the gift of hope. May I always believe in the beauty of life, the power to goodness, and the right to joy. Shana Tova.